Hello, and welcome back to the ADHD Awareness podcast series. My name is Kirtan Patel, and I am your host. Today, I am thrilled to bring back Dr. Stephen P. Hinshaw. He is a distinguished professor at UC Berkeley and a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at UC San Francisco. Dr. Hinshaw received his undergraduate degree from Harvard University and earned his PhD in clinical psychology from UCLA, where he completed rigorous training in developmental psychopathology, assessment, and intervention. He has spent decades as a clinician scientist working at the intersection of research, teaching, and public engagement. At UC Berkeley, Dr. Hinshaw has held numerous leadership roles, including serving as the chair of the psychology department. His academic work spans developmental psychology, clinical science, neuroscience, and public mental health, with a particular focus on ADHD, neurodevelopmental conditions, and mental health stigma across the lifespan. He has published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific articles, edited major academic volumes, and has authored over a dozen influential books for both professional and general audiences. His work has been supported by major research funding agencies and has helped shape diagnostic practices, educational policy, and public understanding of ADHD. In addition to his research, Dr. Hinshaw is widely recognized for his leadership in stigma reduction efforts, including initiatives aimed at improving mental health literacy, increasing access to care, and humanizing psychiatric conditions through science-based storytelling. I am also grateful for Dr. Hinshaw for previously joining on a podcast episode about ADHD and stigma. And today, we will be diving into ADHD in girls, one of the key specialties of Dr. Hinshaw. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks again for having me on.
So for my first question, Dr. Hinshaw, for decades, ADHD was largely considered a disorder for hyperactive boys. From your research perspective, why were girls historically overlooked in ADHD diagnosis?
So that's a long answer I could give, and some talks I give, I have a kind of top 10 or maybe bottom 10 list as to why it's been ignored for so long. But I'll make a few key points. This isn't true just about ADHD. It's not true just about human research. It's true even in basic animal research, where the majority of studies of animal physiology either look at the male of the species only, or if they do include females, they don't really analyze for what might be sex or gender differences. And so this is, because men are stable and women have estrus, or female animals have estrus, and women have menstrual cycles, and they're atypical and erratic, and all those stereotypes. This is also true in a lot of biomedical research. Women die of MI, myocardial infarction, heart attacks, a lot. Men do too, but most of the models are based on men, not women. And even in the ADHD realm, to get a research grant from the federal government for decades, you had to use a certain instrument, a screening tool called the hyperkinesis index, which, to make a long story short, was a 10-item screener. So it could be completed in a couple of minutes by a parent or a teacher. But the items included acts as if driven by a motor, restless in the squirmy sense, restless always up and on the go, lots of impulsive. Only 2 of the 10 items had to do with inattention. And because females are more likely to show exclusive inattention than males, the very screening tool that was mandated to be used to get a research grant was biased against selecting girls. So I could go on and on. The final point is that we know now that girls can and do have ADHD, but just as with autism spectrum disorders and Tourette, neurodevelopmental disorders, there are more males than females in the general population. The male brain overall is a bit slower to mature than the female brain throughout childhood, beginning to catch up, adolescence in the 20s. Girls then also are very interested, many times more than boys, in doing well in school and having friends and being a good girl, if you will. And so too many girls compensate and cope and mask. And so it's not until middle school or high school or post-high school or a first very intimate relationship, that the symptoms really become overwhelming and the diagnosis is made much later. So girls can and do have ADHD. It's been historically neglected for a long time, and still today the diagnosis is often delayed in many females.
Yes, so that brings up an interesting point. Was diagnostic criteria for the longest time based on predominantly male samples?
Well, so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if we base the diagnosis based on the symptoms that boys, or now men, of course, we used to think ADHD stopped at puberty. It was a boy disorder, certainly not a girl disorder, and certainly not a woman or man disorder. Um, but if the presentation is the typical Tom Sawyer syndrome, the white middle-class boy who won't paint the white picket fence and squirms in school and likes to play hooky and all that stuff, we now know that the basic symptom picture is pretty similar in males and females, in boys and girls, in men and women. But women, girls and women, may express the hyperactivity more as a hyperverbalness, talking too much, interrupting. Well, and it's not just because they're rude, because if they wait for the other speaker to finish his or her sentence, they'll forget what was said at the beginning. And so it's probably a function of poor working memory. So yes, the in short answer to your question, the stereotype, the myth is girls don't have ADHD. The diagnostic criteria are based largely on boy and male presentation. Again, I don't think there's a fundamentally different symptom presentation across the sexes, but the means of expression and certain kinds of emotional anxiety and depression problems often more accompany ADHD in girls and women than they do boys and men.
Yeah, that comes to show how referral bias can often influence the understanding of ADHD. In your Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal Study, you found that ADHD in girls is less overt hyperactivity and more just internal distress and inattention. And that comes to show, as you said, that it was never rare in girls, it was just less visible to adults.
That's right. It was never as rare as 10 or 20 to 1 male to female, which I learned in grad school decades ago. It is about 2.5 to 1, even when you make a thorough non-biased diagnosis. But interestingly, now if you move into adulthood, because girls are more likely to have the exclusively inattentive form of ADHD, now called presentation, those are the symptoms that are more likely to persist more than the hyperactive, fidgety, squirmy behaviors. So if you open an adult clinic today, you might get closer to 1-to-1 women and men with ADHD.
Yes, so you launched one of the most important longitudinal studies in the field, which is the Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal Study, which I brought up previously. Could you explain how that project began and why it was so important?
So back in the 1990s, over 30 years ago, there were a couple of conferences and people were saying, maybe ADHD does exist in girls more than we think. And when I would run treatment studies or summer camp, day camps, we'd get hundreds of boys to apply and a handful of girls. And so we were going to have a camp of 75 boys and 4 girls. That wouldn't be fair to anybody, and we wouldn't learn enough about the girls. So I wrote a grant to the National Institute of Mental Health, focused on the growth of in childhood ADHD in girls. And we used our summer camp methodology, which is girls who'd never met before come together. A lot had ADHD, a minority, about 40%, were neurotypical. They interacted together. The staff were blind to who was whom, if you will, and the girls were, and we got tons of data. And from the first moment of the first orientation for the first summer camp in 1997, I got bold when I met with the families and said, we would really like to study your daughters the rest of their lives. Now, we knew that you can only get a federal grant for 5 years at a time, and we'd have to really learn a lot from the summer camps and then new grants for follow-ups, and we were successful doing that a number of times. And because of our diligence and because the families got a free summer camp for their girls, 6 weeks in length, learned so much, wrote reports, advocated, etc., over the years, we had about 94 to 95% of the girls return for follow-up through 16 years until their mid to late 20s. And we just finished our fifth wave where they're all in their 30s and we were over 80%. And so a longitudinal study is really as good as what we call the retention rate. Doesn't mean you're held back. It means you retain the subjects over time. So we think it's representative. And what we've learned, which I'm sure you'll ask about and we'll talk in a minute about, has really changed the way we think about how serious ADHD can be in girls. In some ways similar to boys, but in other ways quite different.
Yeah, so what were the most surprising findings you found as they matured to adolescence and adulthood and so on?
So the main issue, and there's many, is that on average, compared to girls, but there weren't that many girls followed up in the whole history of past research, boys with ADHD often had what we call externalizing aggression, oppositional problems, learning problems, problems in school, problems with illicit substances, especially nicotine, but also alcohol and illicit substances. What we learned from the BGALS, the Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal Study, because the acronym was pretty apt, is that the period of early to mid-adolescence is pretty crucial. Puberty's happening, middle school is no picnic for anybody, but especially if you're a girl who isn't as focused and has more trouble sustaining attention and maybe has a working memory that isn't as sharp as some of her classmates. And you don't really understand why. Well, I guess I got this diagnosis of something called ADD or ADHD when I was a girl. What does that really mean? I got some treatments for it. I went to the summer camp, but all of a sudden, teachers are giving me grades that I know I can do better than I'm getting in school. And a lot of friends have shunned me. They say I talk too much or too fast, or I interrupt, and I don't read their facial cues very well. So to make a long story short, in the transition from girlhood to adolescence to very early adulthood, early to mid 20s, our girls with ADHD showed a shockingly high rate of what we call non-suicidal self-injury, cutting, self-mutilating, burning, knocking your head until you leave bruises, etc., as a way of expressing distress. In fact, almost a majority of our girls with ADHD, compared to a far smaller percentage in our neurotypical sample, had shown those problems. And then the other side of the coin with self-harm is actual attempted suicide, where the intent is to end your life. And in one of the findings we published 10 years ago and have followed up with more longer-term follow-up data, the girls with ADHD compared to the neurotypical girls, again, same neighborhoods, closely matched, had more than double the rates of attempted suicide, and especially if they had also received physical or sexual abuse or neglect in childhood, that rate rose to nearly 3 to 1. So ADHD is highly heritable. Genes play a big role in contributing to whether I have ADHD and you don't, or vice versa. Genes cover a lot of ground in explaining those differences. But the non-genetic factor of being traumatized and maltreated adds to the risk of suicidality and, to a lesser extent, non-suicidal self-injury. And when we first published those findings over a decade ago, it got a lot of attention. And we now know from worldwide, even population-based studies, Scandinavia, other European countries, other continents, people with ADHD do have a higher risk of suicidal behavior than neurotypical people, maybe because they also inherit a propensity for depression at the same time. But I think also, in large measure, not only because of early trauma, but because of the consequences of ADHD and feeling you're inadequate, and often the depression follows the ADHD. We also found extraordinarily high rates. 45% of our girls with ADHD had one or more unplanned pregnancies throughout their adolescence and adulthood, compared to 10% of our neurotypicals. And the girls with ADHD, once they got into adolescence and early adulthood, were 3.5 times more likely to receive intimate partner violence or sexual violence. So it's a pattern that the depression secondary to feeling you're a failure and not having good role models. And even if the girls got treatment when they were younger, a lot of teens with ADHD don't know what it is or don't think they really have it or don't like the medications they're on. So we think it's a big public health issue for recognition of ADHD in girls before these later life problems really escalate.
Yeah, so your research has shown that girls with ADHD often experience particularly severe social difficulties and peer rejection. So why does ADHD affect social functioning so strongly in girls compared to boys?
So it plays a role in boys too, don't get me wrong. But we'll stereotype a bit, but I think this is an accurate one. Girls really care about social relationships. A guy can be a loner and successful, but for a girl, losing your kind of your people, your tribe is it can be devastating. And girls are very sensitive to social difficulties. Who's not reading how I'm really feeling? Who made an inappropriate comment? And so what we call peer rejection, the kind of being not expelled from school, well, that would harm your academics. But if you're expelled from the peer group informally and you don't get to the birthday parties, or you're excluded or snubbed, or something snide about you is said online, that peer rejection, we now know, we measured this very carefully in girlhood during our summer camps, that peer rejection, which was pretty extreme in a lot of our girls with ADHD, actually predicted over the next 20 years some of their cognitive and executive functions, especially how they could inhibit responses. So being rejected by those you would like to be close with is a pretty devastating consequence for any kid, but especially a girl with ADHD.
Yeah, so in your Henshaw et al. 2002 study in developmental and psychopathology, you actually found that girls with ADHD that violate social norms are usually perceived more negatively by the public, for example, for interrupting, emotional impulsivity,
Yep.
all of that, and that leads to exclusion from friendships, which you just explained can be very detrimental to their internal perception. And that leads me to my next question of another powerful finding from your longitudinal study is the elevated risk for internalizing disorders for girls with ADHD. So why do girls appear to have higher rates of anxiety and depression?
So let's forget ADHD for a moment. Let's look at the first decade of life and the second decade of life. In the first decade of life, boys are likely to have neurodevelopmental conditions more than girls, not 10 to 1, maybe 2 or 3 to 1. And then when puberty hits, which is starting ever earlier, average age is now probably under 12 in girls, and with some even under 10. The social expectations change. If you go to a co-ed school, you're going to get hit on by guys. And starting at age 11 and 12, again, regardless of ADHD, girls skyrocket ahead of boys. So by the age of 18, they're 2 to 2.5 times more likely than boys to have experienced a major anxiety disorder or a major depressive disorder. And that's both because of hormones, genetic determinism, if you will, heritability, but also because girls' self-esteem plummets when they're not perfect at everything that they do. And again, this is irrespective of ADHD. I wrote a book 17 years ago called The Triple Bind, Saving Our Teenage Girls from Today's Pressures, which had kind of a cultural explanation for this phenomenon more than a biological one. If I'm a girl, I've got to be nurturing, caregiving. It's what girls do. They're going to be mothers. Since the women's movement in Title IX, I got to be competitive. 60% of college students in America are now women, athletically and academically. But number three, I've got to do all this effortlessly and looking pretty hot while I do it in a sexualized way. You can't do all three of those things simultaneously. It's impossible. But if you feel that you're not living up to yourself as a girl, if you don't, you're going to internalize. And now, if you have self-regulation issues, And if some of your executive functions make it harder for you to succeed in school, that's going to multiply that risk even more. So I think it's both biology and culture when we put ADHD together with this kind of crazy perfectionism. And a new study just came out last week, a review of many, many other studies, that perfectionism in young people, high school and college students, is never been higher in the United States. And this perfectionism, the drive to do everything well and perfectly all the time, I think is a player in this too.
Does delayed diagnosis contribute to this in any significant extent?
So, almost certainly yes. Why am I not certainly certain? Because we don't have a way of randomly assigning girls with equivalent ADHD. You get diagnosed at 5 and you at 7 and you at 9. I mean, it would be unethical. You can't do an experiment like that. But the longer a girl goes feeling it's her fault, wondering why teachers and peers dislike her and disrespect her, struggling with self control without some knowledge that this is a biologically based condition. There are self control treatments, reward based behavioral treatments, medications that can help you. The longer you go, it's a lot like dyslexia and other learning disabilities, reading disorder. The longer you go, the further behind you get. You can always play catch up ball, but it gets harder to do.
Yeah, that answer reminds me of your 2007 book, Mark of Shame, where you talk about how a misunderstanding of a psychiatric condition can lead to negative self-perception, which is arguably even more detrimental to you than the misunderstanding in the first place.
Yeah,
What are
yeah.
some signs teachers and parents should watch for that might suggest ADHD in girls, especially when symptoms are more subtle?
So it's fairly easy to pluck out the Tom Sawyers in a classroom, but we know that the white middle class Tom Sawyer is that's old school. That was referral bias. People of all ethnicities, races, religions have ADHD at fairly equivalent rates around the world. But those boys are often obstreperous and they're disruptive. But what about a boy, or now especially a girl, whom we don't think can really have ADHD, is suffering in silence? She can't understand or respond to a 3 or 4 part. I want you to open your book to page 12. I want you to copy the second paragraph, paste it somehow into your device, and then you have 4 questions. Wait a minute. I was still on opening my book to that chapter. When it's not automatic, when you're really struggling, it's like a kid with a learning disability. It's like, what if you went to school in a foreign language all the time? You just didn't really understand. The self blame, the feeling of inadequacy, the shame that goes along with it. Again, I'm answering a couple questions at once here. Um, but girls carry with them this internalized sense of failure, which can lead to even more anxiety and depression, which are commonly occurring in girls as they hit puberty. And if we don't take steps to catch it early, or even in teen years, I mean, there are many instances now of women not getting diagnosed till the 30s, 40s, 50s, or later. And the field is finally catching up that girls and women can have ADHD. So refocus me because I could go in a million directions here.
So you talked a lot about how, like, first off, calling attention to it in the first place and helping them understand that it's not their fault. And actually, lots of your research highlights how multimodal treatments are actually the most effective way about going
That's
about
right.
that, which includes medication when appropriate, behavioral therapy, academic support, and most importantly, social skills training. And that was all highlighted in many studies of yours, including the multimodal treatment study. And so that actually leads me to my next question. Speaking of research, looking forward, what are the most unanswered questions about ADHD in girls?
So, first of all, what what are the actual boy-girl sex differences? A paper is just about to be published between collaborators at Vanderbilt University and me and a grad student of mine at Berkeley, showing that in terms of the basic symptoms of ADHD, you have to take into account that girls may express those differently. The differences aren't as big as we would have thought. I mean, people talk about a female brain versus a male brain, and obviously hormones shape different patterns of connectivity in different sexes. Uh, the unanswered question is, why then, with a core set of self-regulatory and self-control problems, do girls tend over time to really internalize? I mean, these statistics on non-suicidal self-injury, cutting, and attempted suicide are very alarming, as are the statistics on unplanned pregnancy, sexual violence, etc. And again, it's not all biology, it's not all culture and expectations, but it's this combination of earlier puberty in girls, impossible expectations to meet, unexplained or unexplainable to many girls, that this really is a biologically based condition that you can't control. It runs in families. Many family trees show a lot of ADHD over generations. And trying to get the world to be less stigmatizing, which is the theme from a question ago, and girls to be less punitive to themselves and get the support they need. In fact, once you get to be a teen, it's not only the reward charts, et cetera, of behavioral treatment programs, but cognitive behavioral therapies, organizational skills, anger management, time management that can play a big role in coping with ADHD, and even having some of your out of the box thinking be a positive trait for you, not just a disruptive one.
Well, I appreciate the answers you gave today. One thing's for sure, your research has really helped open the light and highlight all these previously unseen characteristics of ADHD in girls. And I am very sure that it'll help many girls around the world unlock their potential when they finally understand who they really are. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed already, be sure to subscribe. And thank you, Dr. Hinshaw, once again, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks a million. Appreciate it.